Hey guys, I'm Brandon from Pixel Planet. We are a full-service video production company at Pixel Planet Studios. Today I want to kind of go through some visual effects things, and my goal is that we all leave here thinking a little bit more like visual effects artists. And so if you're on set and don't have a visual effects supervisor, you might have a little bit of a better idea how to shoot something to make your lives easier in post-production. Granted, it's always a good idea to have a visual effects supervisor on set, but that may not always be the case. Like, we know how certain things work, and we've probably also had those situations where we saw some footage and said, man, if I fix this one thing on set, we wouldn't have had these hours and hours in post-production. So while my sweatshirt said fix it in post, because that's kind of my fun title at Pixel Planet, because I enjoy doing all of these visual effects things in post-production. Obviously, we like to fix stuff correctly on set so we don't have to spend extra hours. When we talk about certain things today, we're going to talk about what might make a shot harder versus making a shot, might be a little bit easier. And my goal isn't necessarily to dissuade you from harder shots, but understanding what makes a shot harder or easier obviously sometimes means money paid in post-production. Sometimes it means extra hours and more coffee and all-nighters to do things. So we love challenges here at Pixel Planet. We're often doing tests of harder things, just proof of concept and to see that we can do them. But when you're up against a deadline, as you'll see in some of our even more advanced corporate projects, we do certain things to scale back and make things a little bit easier for us or more budget friendly. You might use visual effects for a number of things, including holograms and magic and portals. And then there's also things such as production limitations, not the fantastical things like those other ones, but more things you might not really realize are VFX shots. But this production limitation, we looked at the shot last year, and some of you may have been here during Liminal's Expo when this was shot. There was a very practical thing of a road being closed, and it was unavoidable that those cars were there. So this is a matte painting shot that we had to paint out the cars and track this into the shot to sell the shot. And so things like this are really common where you may not know their visual effects, but they fix logistical issues. And then this is a very common one, phone replacements, a shot a lot of you may have had to do before. And that happens sometimes because a client doesn't know what their app is going to look like or may not have access to it. And so, you shoot it on green or black. And then there's things like this where the homeowners don't want you to draw on their walls and spend hours repainting. So again, you may look at this and figure this could be some sort of visual effects thing, but this is the type of thing that we can do in a commercial to sell a certain vibe. In this one, it was crazy kids at the house and saying like we need more space, and the only way to really achieve this was through visual effects. So some of the things we're going to look at today are locking off the camera and how that can be helpful. We're going to look at shooting clean plates. We're going to look at tracking markers. We're going to look at screen replacements, types of tracking, green screen, set extensions, and then some additional tips and tricks. Okay, so let's start with locking off the camera. The big thing is like the motion tracking of the camera, something like if you're using a clean plate or if you're like anything you put into the scene needs to move how your camera moves. So that alone adds an extra layer of complexity. So this is a shot we did for a 48-hour film project this year. We only had 48 hours to do a number of visual effects shots. So locking down the camera was big for this. The regular footage and then a clean plate. And the clean plate is just a shot of me not in it at all. And then in that clean plate, we did a couple extra little things like dropping the beer can and the cup to sell that. And then basically I isolated my body to do that whole effect of sucking the body into the record. And there's other little things in this shot. There's this area on the ground that kind of brightens up, and you can't see because once I bring up this play bar, it disappears. But you get the point that I'm trying to make. There's all these little things. And so the thing on the ground is another example of that's kind of a quick mask I can draw. If the shot moves, you have to either track that or adjust that mask. So all of the little fine details that we end up doing in a visual effects shot also tend to get more complex. Again, there's lots of moving shots in our VFX reel. I'm not trying to say never do that. It's just one of those things to think about if you're trying to simplify it a little bit. Also, one of the things I might recommend is to shoot your more ambitious shot and then also shoot a lockdown as a safety so that if you get into post-production and go, oh, we can't solve this shot, you have a backup option instead of having to scrap the shot. Another thing that makes it easier to do is a split screen. I only had one of these costumes, but we were able to sell this shot as multiple, I think they're called Pink Soldier characters, walking around Liminal. And you can see like the top would be the original security cam footage that was used and combined into a single shot. Something like that, again, you could in theory move the camera, but it's going to be so much harder. And one of the ways you can actually achieve that seamlessly is something called a motion control rig, which could essentially allow you to do the exact same camera move multiple times. So it would be a way that you could shoot your original footage and then shoot a clean plate with the exact same movement. And then things would work a little bit more like a lockdown shot. Especially if you're starting with VFX or you're in a time crunch, locking down your camera can be great. This is another example of a lockdown shot, and we had a pretty tight turnaround on these. Dan LaGuardia was the DP on this. They shot this footage on green and gave us the CG render, and we did the compositing of it. So top left, you'll see that raw footage, you'll see the still render, and you'll see the matte that was created. And one of the advantages to locking down the camera, again, we knew we had a pretty quick turnaround on this, but even for them, they only had to give us one single frame versus if the camera's moving, we would have to track that camera and we would have to, let's say this is a 6-second shot, 24 frames a second, like you do the math, and CGI renders can be pretty intensive. We often have renders going overnight for that reason. So one frame versus thousands of frames for a commercial is kind of a big deal when you're in a time crunch. All of these things over here, you can see there's some faked reflections in this pot. You can see all of the handles have some reflections in them. You can see there's reflection over here and in here, as well as a contact shadow here and some shadow as she walks by over here. All of those little details are little mattes that are drawn here to accept a reflection. And this was one of those where there's just so many of those, and to track all of those and then think about as the camera moves how that would change the reflection, like being at a different angle, just complicates those things so much more. So this is definitely an example of a shot that would be exponentially harder if there was movement in it, because there are so many reflective surfaces and shadows being cast. The next thing we're going to talk about is shooting clean plates. So even if there's movement in your final shot, we generally like lockdown clean plate with no motion blur. If there's a big movement in the shot, I would prefer maybe 2 plates. Get a plate kind of your start and a plate of your end, and I can kind of stitch those together. But like I talked about before, without a motion control rig that is going to do the exact same movement at the exact same speed and land in the exact same place, I would rather have something with no motion blur that I can put in there, and then essentially I would track that in along with what the camera does, and that would give us our final result. So this is an example from the Squid Game video that we just watched. And this is kind of a very rough example of, we didn't need a plate of the starting movement. We shot a plate with our ending movement, and you can see that in the top middle. And then we tracked, and again, what you're seeing on the top right is like a very kind of rough version of it, but just to kind of visualize what it looks like tracked into the shot. So we now have a quote unquote empty hallway to remove the bodies. So not sure how you guys thought, if you thought we shot kind of just with dummy heads, but they were they're real heads and real bodies, and they kind of just moved up as Andrew lifted his arms up. And we totally could have done like some sort of green suit. There still would probably be some sort of rotoscoping involved, but actually in the original reference, I think that line near John's neck looks like a little bit of a hard edge to me. And in the original reference, they have kind of a similar thing. So I actually thought about doing like black turtlenecks. You know, ultimately, we just did this kind of one night, kind of scrappy. I was pretty confident we could do something. You know, in this shot, I really wanted their bodies not to intersect with Andrew's body much. So I was hoping their bodies could be off here. They intersect a little bit. I had to do a little bit of cleanup, but for the most part, it was a fairly easy shot. If you want to see more, we are going to have a tutorial on our YouTube in the next couple weeks, I'm hoping, which will basically walk through how to do this shot in After Effects. And the reason I talked about the turtleneck would be we would just get a better, you know, so it's basically rotoscope. There's no green screen. But to rotoscope, I think we would get a little bit of a more even line potentially if we had like black here.
Player 432. Looking for these.
The next section is tracking markers. This is a project some of you may be familiar with. This was the Rivian project, and this is one of the wide VFX shots. In the upper left-hand corner, you can see those tracking markers. The reason we use tracking markers is to give us points of contrast to be able to track. So point of contrast could be the difference between like a lighter value and a darker value. It could be a difference between color values. The idea with this is that we're putting in a background plate behind the car. So if I play this again real quick, you can see obviously it doesn't move much, but some of the shots it may have moved a little bit more than this. But the camera is mounted to the car, so we really wanted to see how the background moves in comparison so that we can kind of feel the suspension of the car. And in this case, these tracking markers are placed in the front windshield because I knew that they would be most out of the way. You know, if these don't quite key perfectly, like, and there's some cleanup behind our subject, it would be a lot easier because our subject doesn't move in front of them here. As well as I wanted to preserve some of these nice reflections here, ideally, and add those into the background plate that we're going to be adding. The moving footage that gives it the appearance that they're driving and then coming to a stop. And so that was the decision made on the wide shot. On the close-up here, you can see that they're really out of focus, but you can see the tracking markers. So in the close-up shot, we had to move the tracking markers from here to here so that we had an area that we could track. In the wide shot, we want to move them here. I think at one point we had some back here. Just knowing that they wouldn't intersect with them as much. And the reason we just have these two, we're just looking for a fairly simple motion on this shot. You know, that should give us enough information. In this close-up, we don't see quite as much. These should be enough for us to kind of figure out that motion. And, you know, we're really not seeing that reflection as much, but even if we were, we don't really have much of another choice on this close-up shot. I think we have another example here. This was a fairly complicated shot, and this is a good example of talking about points of contrast. This shot was really tricky because she is interacting with an oven that we replaced with CGI. We did the compositing and we did the tracking, and they did the render. So this is one where they had to render out every frame because the camera is moving. Not only that, the camera is like rotating around her. And talking about points of contrast, you know, you can see like there are points of contrast on this plane. If we talk about kind of like planes, like we have, you know, if you flat surfaces, you see this kind of plane here. There are some points, like these corners give us some points. We added a few more tracking markers, I think mostly because we knew that these ones in the foreground would be really easy to paint out, and it couldn't hurt to have more. And then in the background, you see like there's a lot of, you know, points of contrast here. There's some stuff on the countertop. But this back wall was an area I was really concerned about because it's just a plain wall, and you know she goes in front of it. So these tracking markers were added to give us more points of contrast because really, other than this little area up here, there's not much there. You know, you don't need tracking markers on everything. A lot of footage, you know, has there's plenty of things to track that are built in. So we really want to use tracking markers in cases where there aren't those points of contrast that might be able to help us solve a shot. And good cases of those are green screens, and another case is something like this where we know it's going to be a harder shot. And one of the reasons it's a harder shot is because we needed to add a CG oven in that's like the perfect dimensions. And we actually struggled a little bit tracking this. We had to try a couple different softwares because we could get a good enough camera track that if we needed to throw a piece of text floating in space that looked the right orientation, it would have been totally fine. But the focal distance, it was really important for this. And some of you camera people may know this, but the focal lengths and focal distances can really impact how a 3D cube, like the fall off distance. And we struggled to get the right focal length solve, and we had some of that information on set, so we were able to like plug in some of that. The software we ended up using was Simplifies to solve this, but it was a little bit tricky. Even for us who had done a lot of tracking in the past, and so I think all those tracking markers in the back were helpful in that situation as well. So this was the final shot right here. You can see those tracking markers are gone from the back wall, and the whole thing was putting in this oven. So the chicken wings are real, the tray is real, the rack is real, everything else is CG. But this area right in here is kind of what I was talking about. We really needed the right fall off distance because it's meeting the other two sides of the counter. Next section is screen replacements. These obviously are a fairly common thing, like I talked about before. They shot on green. I will say you can tell this is dated because of the shape of the phone screen. Phones have gotten so crazy in the shapes now with this cutout, and some of them, have weird shapes. There's even some that have on the sides, they have little screens and stuff. So phone replacements have become a little harder. Because of that, green might be a good option to really see what pixels would be illuminated on the screen. That being said, I have similarly found preserving reflections way easier with black. If you know what you're going to be putting on the screen, which often people don't know on set, if you know that it's going to be a black app or a dark app, black is probably a really good choice. If you're going to shoot something that's like much lighter, white might even be a decent choice. But certainly, because white, you would have less of that green spill that you talked about. Because that's usually part of the process is additionally, in addition to replacing the screen, also trying to bring down some of that green that is cast off. I will say phones are very bright, so turning down the brightness on your phone is probably a good choice, and you will probably get a plenty bright image in your camera. So there's no reason to to have your brightness turned up too high. This is an example of a black screen. So for this, this was actually part of that series for GE that we did, and we shot these both ways just to have the latitude. And I wasn't sure quite how well this would track either, but I was able to get a solid track with the black, and you can see in the bottom how nice of a reflection I was able to preserve. And certainly helps, like I said, that it is a dark app and a black background. If this was a really bright app, you probably wouldn't see too much of the actual reflection. So it could be a good time to think about that. In this bright app that they're going to have, we wouldn't see a lot of reflection. We'll get potentially more solid tracking if we go green. This is a good example. This was for Roger Hill's feature Stalker Jane, and these are two phone replacement shots in the film, which are very different levels of difficulty. So having the phone with nobody crossing in front of it is way easier than the example on the right, where the phone goes out of frame, a hand goes in front of it, glasses go in front of it, which magnify what's on the screen. These are really good things to think about. Like I told you, we enjoy challenges here, but if you're in a time crunch, you want to be doing the one on the left and not the one on the right. So the more you can keep things in frame, not having things go in front of them certainly makes those easier. This is an app I was going to talk about. If you have these types of things and want to shoot green, it has tracking markers on it. And the cool thing about this app is that you can interact and nothing happens. So you're not going to like swipe to the next photo if you take a photo. And don't let these reviews dissuade you, because the reason is people don't know what the app does and that you're supposed to use it for film. Yeah, they said just a green screen with no buttons or options. How's this even here? We actually prefer that. We prefer the lack of buttons. And I just think they didn't put a lot of information in the description, and that's why this probably exists. But we have used it, and it's a solid solution for that. Okay, so these are different types of tracking that I wanted to talk about. This was kind of the basic 2D tracking we talked about. That would look at something like certain pixels or points and trying to find how those 2 points move relatively scale-wise, so how far they move apart, how they move rotation-wise, and how they move positionally. And then there's something called planar tracking, which is tracking surfaces. Imagine like the kitchen cabinets or something. You're tracking any sort of flat surface. So these examples I have are like the steps, the walls of that shot. That's how I also did the cell phone, was with planar tracking. And that software I'm using is Mocha. There's a free version bundled in After Effects, and there's also a pro version, which has a couple additional things, such as mesh tracking, which is the top right example. Mesh tracking is great for tracking things like uneven surfaces. So I have a book, a shirt, a face. You can see there where it's tracking their face. You can even see it like as they open their eyes. It's basically mimicking and trying to create like a mesh, and then tracking how each one of those pieces of mesh moves. So to do something like a face, which is going to it's not a total flat surface. As they open their eyes, like this part moves, this part doesn't. So that was a good solution for adding all of that blood and other stuff to their face. Then we have 3D camera tracking, which is basically trying to, in a moving shot, your camera was moving on set, you're trying to figure out how that camera moved and create a virtual digital camera that does that exact same movement so that you can add stuff in 3D space. So for people who aren't too familiar in that, picture like a 3D software, how you can move around in a 3D software. If you create a virtual 3D camera, you can now add stuff in 3D space, and you can figure out, well, this wall was at this position in 3D space. I'm going to add something there. And you might throw in a 2D object like text or some asset somewhere in 3D space, or you might actually add a 3D model that would move with your scene. And then there's something kind of works similarly, which is like 3D object tracking. So that would be like trying to track a 3D object. You could rotate a 3D object or something in 3D along with that object. So you're not trying to match the camera per se. You're trying to match like how the object moved. So what I'm showing, I believe, is GeoTracker. I believe this is an add-on that you can use with After Effects, because I'm a big After Effects guy. But After Effects, isn't natively, well, they're adding more 3D, but they're not natively like a 3D application. I think they have something for After Effects. They also have something for Blender, which if you're going to be, there might be more use cases, because if you're going to track a 3D object and like replace that, you probably do want to use a 3D application like a Blender. Yeah. Okay, the next one is green screen. I think most people in here know why we use green screen. The idea is that green is like the easiest color to remove to separate the subjects that we have there from the background. So we used blue here because the money that is coming down we figured would be harder to isolate from green. So in this situation we used blue in front of the money, and we already had our green popped up here. So we shot this in a sound stage. We talked a little bit about matching lighting. In the studio, we also tried to match lighting. You can actually see we had a real tree branch there to cast some shadows, I think, in some of our close-ups. And we tried to match the light similar to this CG sky and tree house that we were going to be adding to it. But rotoscoping is becoming more viable as well. So if you're going to have like a main subject, you're isolating and adding a background, green and blue is still like a great option. In this case, there was no green screen whatsoever. To put those fire elements, I used some roto tools, and I'm showing some of them here. This is actually from a tutorial I did. I had used roto brush and mask prompter to cut him out to put the fire behind him. So those types of things are starting to become a little bit more viable, especially if you're cutting out a person like in the background versus like a main speaker. You know, you really want a nice sharp key on them to remove the background. You know, these tools of rotoscoping are starting to become a little bit easier. And this is a case, you know, when we do green screen, sometimes we do it in studio, but when possible, we like to do it on location. So this was a shot where our characters walked out of a portal, and you know, instead of doing something like this, like shooting a plate, like just shooting the background and then doing this in a soundstage, you know, popping this up on set so that it matches everything else, like makes all the sense in the world because they're lit just how they should be. So something to think about, like when you're doing green screen work, like you don't necessarily need to be in like a soundstage or a studio. Like some of the best like green screen you may get is on set. Obviously, like lighting in addition to the real lighting, like lighting your characters, lighting your green screen so that, you know, you can, I think we got a pretty good key out of this, but you can see all of the shadows on the blue. Ideally, you get that as evenly lit as possible. You know, again, certain production limitations happen. I don't think we had any trouble with this, but those are all like considerations when you're doing blue and green screen. All right, set extensions. So we looked at that when we cleaned up the cars that were all parked in the street. This is kind of a cool one we actually did in this room. You know, there's some cool things going on in this that I really like. These God rays that kind of mimic the real lighting that was on set. This is kind of a good example of, you know, one of my last tips and tricks I was going to talk about is like maybe limiting the amount of visual effects shots you have. So we shot this one wide shot to establish the room that we were in, and then we went into all close-ups. So there was only one shot here that I had to do, but it kind of sold the space that we were in. Characters are not moving in front of the matte painting. Like all the area that we're creating outside of where the people are, they're not interacting with. They're not going in front of. So it's kind of just, you know, scaling this down, like masking this out, and then building this world around them. So that made it a little bit easier. Versus a shot like this, where the camera is moving, the talent is moving, and there are sparks flying in front of these mountains. So this is one of those, you know, production limitation things. Like it allowed us in Northeast Ohio to shoot in a really cool location. You know, hopefully you can appreciate for like what makes this more difficult. So again, you know, lockdown camera. The people don't move in front of the matte painting that we're creating versus this one where camera's moving, sparks are going in front of it, people are going in front of it. You know, I talked about like how you could mask one part, and in a lockdown shot, that's all you have to do. Like this over here, you know, moves, and as we push in, like the shape of it is going to change a little bit. So definitely becomes a little bit trickier. A couple last little tips and tricks as far as like what can make things like easier and harder. Motion blur can make things trickier. So that's another reason when the camera doesn't move, we now don't have to mimic that motion blur that happens when the camera moves. So that motion blur can also sometimes make tracking a little bit harder. It can make you know, rotoscoping a little bit harder because you have these like blurry edges. And for all of those reasons, cutting down on motion blur can be helpful, specifically if you're doing something that's like a more difficult shot. So some of those GE things that we looked at, we did try to cut down on motion blur. So things like lowering the shutter angle on the camera and a higher frame rate so that you're not exposing as long can cut down on motion blur. And you can add some of that motion blur in post is always an option. So for trickier visual effects shots, that sometimes makes sense. Another thing you can do is shoot at a higher resolution. You know, if you're delivering 4K, maybe 6K, either so that you have more pixels to track, or you could even consider framing for 4K but shooting 6K so that you have extra information on the sides to track. And so imagine that phone going out of frame, but it's actually in frame, if you're planning to basically crop in after the fact. Those might be little things that you could use, if you are planning a shot that you think is going to be like really challenging. And then limiting the amount of VFX shots, like I said, if there's a way that you can maybe use VFX shots to tell a story, but establishing that and then finding a way not to have it in as many shots. Because when we're talking about like the time it takes to do them, if you can sell something once versus having to sell it 8 times and just doing that work over and over and over and over, you'll save some time. So we're now at Q&A. I think we're pretty close to 7 o'clock, which is a happy coincidence. But any more questions? Yep.
Mocha Pro, Mocha Pro, Mocha, Mocha, Mocha Pro. Opacity, buddy, buy me a cup of mocha, yo. Bundle it together, save on the cost. Level up YouTubers, unlock, achieve graphic boss.